Should DJI and others be worried about the rise of the open source drone? Let's discuss. Hi, I'm Ash from DroningON, and there was a very interesting article in ZNet today, which is an online tech blog. The article opens with the headline, "Can a Red Hat for drones unseat China's DJI?" Now, for those of you that don't know, Red Hat is a Linux distribution. It's an operating system. Think of it a little bit like iOS or Microsoft Windows. Red Hat's been around for a long time, and back in the 90s, the rise of Linux led to the bigger operating system players downfalling in many respects because these cheaper players, which were based on an open source platform, entered the market and started to massively undercut. We're in a very similar situation today with drones in the respect that DJI's operating system, the software that runs on DJI drones like your Mavic and your Phantom, is entirely proprietary. DJI own it, they own the intellectual property, and it's locked down to the point where you only really have an SDK as a means of interacting with it. Litchi is one such example that uses the SDK, but via that SDK, their hands are very much tied because they've only got the capabilities that the SDK that DJI write provides. Therefore, while there is the ability to integrate with DJI drones, it is controlled quite strictly. This article is talking about the fact that Red Hat distributions could build the next drone operating system, an operating system that would be open source, which means that basically nobody really owns the intellectual property. It's more of a crowdsourced code base which evolves over time via contributions from multiple outlets all over the world, and that alone gives you an idea of the opportunities here. Now, this is certainly not the first time that there's been an open source drone platform. They've been around for many years, and one of the most popular and well known is Pixhawk, which is now at version 4 and is used very widely. In fact, I know a guy down at the flight field that flies his wing with Pixhawk, largely because of the integrations that Pixhawk brings. The concept of building a drone operating system means that many manufacturers can pick it up and use it. And they already do. In fact, if you look at many of the smaller drone projects over the years, they've been based on some of these open source platforms. But if one were to really rise based on the powerful Red Hat operating system, then maybe it could be adopted by a wider base, including some of the bigger manufacturers who could really flourish using this kind of platform. It would save them time and money in internal development costs and allow them to really focus on the hardware and the integrations with the platform. Now, the first is the way in which open source software evolves. It's very much an open book, with contributors submitting their code branches from all over the world based on their own expertise and their own experience. Once a piece of code is submitted, it's then scrutinized by peers and submitted into the main code branch. But there are challenges with that in the respect that it could allow malware or just simply bad development to get into the operating system of your drone. The other big point to make is that these open source platforms haven't really entered the consumer drone market yet. They've been very much reserved to the build it yourself, the DIY drones. And this would be the big change here. Open source drone software on mainstream retail off-the-shelf drones. In many respects, the challenge is that you're putting the stability of your drone in the hands of multiple developers. And while that sounds great and thoroughly tested, it can lead to issues and bugs. You could argue that that's no different to firmware updates from DJI or other mainstream manufacturers, but still, these guys can just be a kid sat in a room or an old guy sat in his basement. Although it is worth adding that open source is absolutely contributed to by professionals and SMEs around the world. Now, this is a big one for me. It's so important that we take account of aviation law and no-fly zones. And the downside of an open source platform is that there wouldn't necessarily be any mandated restrictions or limitations on flight. Some might see that as a positive, and some have actually invested in Skydio and other brands simply because they don't have any NFZ technology, but I see that as a big no-no. DJI have really led the way in making sure that drone consumers are flying responsibly and within the limits of the law and aviation safety, and I applaud them for that. But sadly, there are consumers out there who simply want to fly when they want to fly, where they want to fly, and open source would probably allow them to keep doing that, and I do see that as a negative. The other challenge with open source software, and I work in the software industry, is the roadmap. And there are multiple conflicts when you don't really have anybody primarily leading the direction of software development. Open source is exactly that. It's open source. And so anybody's able to contribute. People can even pick up the entire package of open source software and build their own branch, their own distributional version of it. That means that the roadmap and direction of that software can become very cluttered, confusing, and unclear. And you also have different priorities and preferences based on whoever's contributing to it. So it can lead to a very unclear future. The other challenge is related to that: ownership. Nobody really owns the open source aspect. Yes, there is an organizational element around an open source entity, but ultimately ownership can be very unclear, especially once people start branching off their own iterations of that build, and it can again become very confusing. The other side of it is when the baseline code upgrades, the iterations or the versions of it must be compatible, and that can also lead to challenges. And finally, when you do have multiple people contributing multiple bits of code with multiple roadmap visions, it can lead to a higher defect rate, because regression testing, which is the testing you do when you change a piece of software and make sure that the existing bits still work, is potentially not going to be quite as well coordinated as a dedicated software company like DJI, who own the software and have full control of it, managing those enhancements. Roadmaps being flexible can be a good thing as well. It means that the route forward is not static, it's not stuck in a rut, and it can be very dynamic. With less enterprise wrap around an open source bit of software, it means that that software has more flexibility to evolve as the market does. It can be more agile and more responsive to what people want, and that definitely is a big benefit to consumers. The other side is a bit we touched on as a negative, but it's also a positive. The fact that with open source you have a load of contributors, not just people who are working there on a 9 to 5 and going home, but people who are dedicated, who are passionate, who love what they do, love writing code, and also the majority will be RC operators, drone operators as well. And that clearly carries with it big benefits. They fully understand the market, they understand the bits that are missing today from the market, and they're actively contributing to solve those gaps. Now, one of the biggest positives is that this means it wouldn't be so sales orientated. We all know that the big manufacturers are not necessarily adding the features that we want, but instead they're adding features that satisfy that tick list, not necessarily features that really do bring value, but just those that are a bit of a sales gimmick. Open source software is far less sales orientated and more focused on what do we actually want. That's a big positive. The other big one is that without that enterprise retail wrap around open source software, the costs are lower and therefore the priorities can be far more focused on delivery. It means that rather than waiting for multiple iterations of firmware updates that we really want to see arrive quicker because there's less political wrap and budgetary considerations. Effectively, your resource is largely free when you're talking about open source software. That's not to say that a project like this wouldn't spawn commercial and enterprise iterations which do have a cost implication and some additional politics around it, but the main code base, as long as the focus is clear, would remain low cost. Now, another big exciting one is that open source software is open, and that means that integration pieces are readily accessible. In other words, because the code is there and everybody can see it and understand how it works, anybody that wants to integrate with it can do so. And that opens up a ton of opportunities. As mentioned with DJI, we only have the SDK, which is a developer kit that DJI open up for applications like Litchi. But with this open source approach, anybody can integrate, and that is quite exciting. Imagine being able to say, hey Google, fly my drone around the house and tell me what my lawn looks like. Does it need mowing? So basically, open source does bring a ton of benefits, but there are some negatives there and we must not ignore them because they are genuine and valid negatives. But do read this article. The link is in the video description to the ZNet website. Please do take a look. Comment below as well with your thoughts on open source and anything you can contribute, because a lot of people in the drone industry work in IT and software. So this genuinely could get quite exciting. Give this video a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you're full of bugs and defects. And of course, click subscribe. Thanks very much for watching.